Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to the 5th annual Future of Speech Online event. My name is Emma Alonso, and I'm the director of the Free Expression Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology, and I'll be your Master of Ceremonies for today. Now, just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. This is the third and final day of our Future of Speech Online event, all focused around the theme of making transparency meaningful. On day one, we had a great overview of the many different kinds of transparency that are part of the tech policy conversation. CDT has just released a guide for policymakers, laying out a framework for understanding how issues like transparency reporting, notice to users, third-party assessments, and researcher access to data all fit under the broad umbrella of transparency. And we heard from experts and advocates about how to keep focused on different groups and communities of users to understand what kinds of information are necessary to actually empower users to navigate their information environments. And yesterday, we had a robust discussion of the Santa Clara principles for transparency and accountability in content moderation, and their focus on user rights and user empowerment. We talked about the progress and opportunities for increasing things like notice to users and appeals mechanisms, but also explored how that doesn't help us solve all of the challenges with online content governance. And we explored what it would take to build a better transparency report to make sure that company disclosures are more relevant, more trustworthy to different audiences. If you missed any of our earlier panels, the video from the event is available on CDT's YouTube page, and we can drop a link to that in the chat. Today's session is also being live streamed and recorded, and the video for that will be archived on CDT's YouTube page. So feel free to share that link around with others who weren't able to attend today. If you have any questions for the organizers or any trouble with Zoom features, please contact events@cdt.org. And during our panel discussions, folks are welcome to submit questions via Zoom's Q&A feature or by email to questions@cdt.org or on Twitter using the hashtag CDTquestions. Today, we have a great agenda for you. Our first panel is going to be discussing one of the hottest topics in transparency, which is enabling independent researchers to access data held by private companies in order to support a better understanding of our information environment. We'll hear some lessons from other industries that could help us think about how to approach the question when pursuing research on social media in particular. And our final panel will address the question of whether transparency can actually be mandated in law. We'll have legal experts from around the world sharing their insights and analysis of how different kinds of transparency mandates will hold up to scrutiny in courts in different legal systems. But first up today, to set the stage for the conversations about researcher access to data, I am delighted to welcome John Sands, the Senior Director for Media and Democracy at the Knight Foundation, and Alexandra Givens, President and CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology. Alex and John, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma. It's wonderful to see the past 3 days of programming at FOSO, and thanks so much to all of you for being with us. John, thank you for being generous with your time for this firestarter conversation before the rest of the paneling, the rest of the programming kicks off. I have to say, I am glad that we invited you to talk about researcher access to data today, because the regulatory landscape is heating up on this issue even more than the discussion in previous weeks. In addition to bipartisan legislation that was recently introduced by Senators Coons, Klobuchar, and Portman, just this week, the European IMCO committee voted out the Digital Services Act with a provision on researcher access to data in Article 31. We only have a short time for our conversation today, but what I want to do is help situate these efforts in broader questions about platform accountability and the type of research that you're trying to fund through the Knight Network. So I'd love if you could start off just by explaining the Knight Foundation's investments in this space, the type of work that you're funding and what the goals are.
Super. Yeah. Well, thanks, Alex. It's always great to be with you, and we're so proud of our association with CDT and the work that you all do. I also want to say thanks to the Charles Koch Institute for sponsoring the really important conversations over the past couple of days. To your question, as you know, Knight has been supporting a new field of research, an emerging field that's interdisciplinary in scope, that really seeks to understand and proactively inform responses to the growing role of digital media in our society. We've made these investments to ensure that policymakers and key stakeholders in industry and civil society are informed by independent, nonpartisan research, and that new legal and policy frameworks protect the public interest and advance fundamental democratic values on topics like content moderation and free expression online, intermediary liability, platform data access for researchers, all things that are very much in the kind of wheelhouse of FOSO. To date, we have invested now more than $60 million in this space, helping to stand up 5 new research centers at universities around the country. And we're supporting a host of new scholarship and policy work at more than 50 other institutions, including at CDT. It's one of the largest targeted investments in Knight's history, and is also, I think, one of our most consequential. So, but at a high level, that's kind of what we're after and what we're doing.
Yeah, it's an incredible investment. And, one of the things that we value the most is being part of a network that connects all of these research centers, the Knight Research Network. And the chatter on that thread is loud about this question of researcher access to data. You're on it too. You see those conversations, you talk to your grantees. I would love for you to give a sense of just, what type of data are people trying to access and why? And can you touch on some of the barriers that they're encountering as they try to do it?
Sure. I mean, maybe let's start by emphasizing why data access is so important, though. That reason is simply that we don't know. In its early years, this field, I think, has been really, really amazing at laying out the range of things that we, like in civil society and in government and the general public, the things that we simply don't know. For example, we know that companies moderate content, but what are the consequences of those moderation policies for free speech in different communities and in different parts of the world? CDT is obviously doing some amazing work in that space. How prevalent is misinformation online and what are its effects? Another huge question. To what extent is social media and algorithmically curated content contributing to the societal fracture and decline in trust in institutions that we know about because political scientists are able to measure those things empirically? Another might be like, to what extent are bad actors able to manipulate algorithms and social networks to increase the distribution of content that in turn manipulates political behaviors or foments the kind of political violence like we saw on January 6th. The Francis Haugen disclosures, I think, point toward the fact that at least one social media company knows more about the answers to these questions than we do, and then our elected government does, and that's a big problem. The near-term consequences of our collective lack of knowledge are evident, and frankly, really quite terrifying for the institutionalists among us. But the long-term prospects are just absolutely untenable. So our legislators and our regulators can't act in the public interest if they're only working with a limited fact base. And we can't solely make decisions based on an industry's limited and often discredited public disclosures. So with few exceptions like Twitter and Reddit, most of the tech companies that have stonewalled attempts by scholars to do independent research with their data. In the absence of more robust data access, these researchers, many of whom Knight has been supporting, as you point out, these researchers have developed some ways to approximate what might be held by those companies, but only approximate. Many folks may also remember that a few years ago, along with several other foundations, Knight supported a joint effort between Facebook and academic researchers that tested a promising model for gleaning insights from user level data held by these companies, or held by at least one of the companies. But this ultimately failed because of privacy concerns. And privacy and liability issues around privacy continue to be the key hurdles to get around. And the risk for all of us, including the companies, is growing day by day. And that's why at Knight we've been supporting not only the basic and empirical research side of this equation, but also the legal and normative work that can imagine better governance and better regulatory frameworks that promote independent research and transparency while also protecting speech and privacy and ultimately the public interest.
Yeah, I mean, you frame that really articulately, because there is a hard trade-off to reach there, right? There's not an easy, bewitched style, wave your magic wand, wiggle your nose and get it fixed. I think there are hard questions to answer. But at the same time, it's so clear that progress needs to be made here. And I think one of the things that we valued seeing in the network is the rich conversation around what reasonable access could look like, right? How it could be done in a responsible way to mitigate those concerns about privacy and security, while still bringing down the barriers so that you can have this independent check on the system. I want to ask you, this summer, the president of the Knight Foundation issued a pretty remarkable statement with other foundation leaders. You had Darren Walker from the Ford Foundation on this letter, John Palfrey from the MacArthur Foundation, a whole host of others, condemning in particular Facebook's shutting down of the NYU Ad Observatory account. Can you just talk a little bit about that one specific fact pattern? And then I think pulling back a little bit, what to make of that moment to have so many voices across civil society choosing to weigh in together in that letter to try and push this issue forward?
Well, I mean, moments of consensus are really rare today, as you know. So it was particularly meaningful to me to see the presidents of so many foundations speak with one voice on this issue, on an issue that Knight has been behind for some years now. That letter that you referred to urged government and industry to ensure data access for researchers who are working in the public interest. And in the wake of the Haugen disclosures, it's only clearer that legislation is required because the Facebook files and the tremendous journalism around them have only shown how much sunlight there is between what these firms likely know and what they make public. And I want to be clear that I'm not supporting or suggesting Knight supports any sort of specific legislation. But last week, I was really, really interested to see that a bipartisan group, as you mentioned, Coons, Klobuchar, and Portman, finally proposed legislation that would accomplish this. The approach that they outlined was largely based on research by Professor Nate Persley at Stanford. And his proposal has three components, and I'm going to paraphrase, so I apologize to Nate and to the senators, but I encourage everybody to check it out. The first, I guess the first pillar of this proposal is that Congress needs to be able to empower a federal agency to compel private platform companies to share data with independent researchers who are working in the public interest. That's absolutely key. The second feature of this proposal is that researchers need to be vetted either by that agency or by some combination of federal agencies and civil society actors. And then the third pillar is that there should be a clearly defined process for accessing the data and publishing the research in a way that guarantees that user privacy is protected in the process. These sound really straightforward, but it's taken, as you know, years and years of research to get this framework in writing. And it's happening at a time when there's real public concern and real momentum for solutions where something actually could get done. So it's really quite exciting. And I most definitely ascribe this outcome to the hard work and tenacity and brilliance of folks like Nate. But I'm really glad that Knight and other foundations are aligned around these values of transparency and an internet and a tech industry that really serves the public interest and advances democratic ideals above all else.
Yeah, well, that's great. I'm going to start to wrap us up because we have a panel that's going to go into more detail on these questions. But we too are excited to see the legislative energy in Congress. As I mentioned, there's this corollary effort happening in the EU. And I think good forms for EU-US conversation through things like the Trade and Technology Council that's been created to help share ideas about the right way to get the balance right. So CDT is focused on these issues, really excited to stay in dialogue with people. And of course, just deeply grateful to you for your support, not just of CDT, but of the field. It really has been amazing to see. So thanks for joining us today. And Emma, I'm going to pass it back to you to kick off the panel.
Great. Thank you so much, John and Alex. Now to keep the conversation going, I am very happy to introduce my colleague, Gabe Nicholas, who is a research fellow with us here at CDT and who will be moderating our next panel. Gabe, take it away.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you, Alex and John, for setting the table for this conversation so nicely. I would like to invite our three panelists at this point to come off of camera. So as many folks have said before, we are here to talk about researcher access to data. And with social media in particular, researchers use social media data to learn, as John said, about the sort of many ways it affects society, from issues around misinformation to the way it affects mental health to sort of many new issues that we haven't discovered yet. Research can serve a clear public good, but many platforms are cagey about giving researchers access to data, both to protect their own corporate interests and to protect the privacy of end users. It's difficult to figure out how to balance these trade-offs, but fortunately there is some precedent. because lots of industries and sectors, including healthcare, smart city technology, education, even gambling, make certain data available to researchers so that they can do work that serves the public good. Today we have three fantastic panelists from different sectors who are going to discuss how their industries sort of manage these trade-offs and potentially give some lessons that could be learned for social media doing the same. CDT will also have a report coming out in the spring about a similar topic. And for this panel, if you want to ask questions, feel free to use the Q&A function or to tweet questions using hashtag CDT questions, or to email us at questions@cdt.org. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Elizabeth Hanson Shapiro, who is a senior research fellow at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia Journalism School. She has written extensively about media policy and platforms, and in particular has a fantastic paper with Ethan Zuckerman about how social media platforms do and do not make data available to researchers. For anyone interested in this topic, I highly recommend checking that out. We also have Beatriz Botero Arcila, who is an assistant professor of law at Sciences Po and an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. And she focuses on data governance in smart city projects, as well as the sharing economy and COVID contact tracing apps. So she has sort of lots of experience around this sort of data governance design in that area. And finally, we have Matthew Herter, who is the director of the Dalhousie University's Health Law Institute and an associate professor and faculty of medicine with a cross appointment to the Schulich School of Law. He studies biomedical innovation policy, including data governance models for clinical trial data in the US and Canada. So welcome to all three of our panelists. And Elizabeth, I'm going to start with you. So John gave us a good start about what kind of data researchers are looking for, but would you give us a bit of a lay of the land about how researchers are trying to access social media data and what roadblocks they're running into from platforms?
Sure. And thank you, CDT, for having me today and for hosting this fantastic and very timely discussion. It's so exciting to, see policy prescriptions actually make it into draft legislation. So really, really pleased to see the movement on that front. This paper with Ethan Zuckerman and colleagues, we really kind of wanted to take a step back and survey the landscape and say, okay, what is currently happening, what are the roadblocks, and what are some potential policy solutions? And I do encourage you, if you have an interest in this topic, to read the paper, because we went through quite an exercise of really being very structured about types and approaches. And so I think it's a nice map of the landscape. So I'm going to run through at a kind of very basic level some of the categories that we saw in terms of data collection efforts, and then also roadblocks. And we categorized the data collection, current range of data collection approaches as kind of falling into two types. So one are, researchers are absolutely accessing platform data with platform cooperation. So that's kind of one type. And then the other are what we called more adversarial data collection techniques. And those techniques researchers are undertaking without platform cooperation. And some of those are more risky and some of them less risky. So under the platform cooperation banner, researchers are absolutely using open APIs. So, like the Twitter API, for example, being one. We are also putting in that bucket new and interesting approaches to differential privacy. So, this was a technique that was used in the Social Science 1 initiative, and it's really a way to add noise to a data set so that you can protect user privacy in any platform release of data. We also heard researchers talk about the importance of contract-based data sharing. Now, that can be problematic from a sort of social good general knowledge perspective, because oftentimes data that's shared under contract has certain restrictions around what can and can't be published. But that kind of data access is happening. And then finally, we also heard about researchers and institutions beginning to think about how to set up controlled environments where there's a high degree of cooperation between platforms and researchers to really protect user privacy and put some strong guardrails around the ways that researchers can access, analyze, and then publish data. But it does allow researchers to have access to like a higher sensitivity than just like through an API, for example. So that's the range of platform cooperation techniques. The adversarial set of techniques, I would say, at the kind of basic level, you have researchers that are just doing logged in manual data collection. There are some ethical issues around that. Does the researcher disclose they're a researcher, when, where, how? It can also sometimes run into terms of service violations. But that's a pretty common method. We're also seeing, and this is really more from the kind of civil society and journalism front, experimentation with panel data. So, the Markup Citizen Browser Project pays a representative panel sample of users to be able to access their feeds. Data donation, like what Mozilla has experimented with. So this is where a user can opt in to sharing their data directly. And then there's, self-reports, which we've seen a lot of, but can sort of be problematic in terms of user recall. But that's a way to sort of, get around some of the legal risks. We've seen a whole bunch of great work come out of journalists again, and outlets like the Markup around auditing and algorithmic auditing. So really, staging an intervention on a platform, like doing a series of keyword searches, for example, to really try to understand how an algorithm works and what results come of that. And then we have the whole set of scraping based methodologies. So, straight up web scraping, which started with the open web, but, has been implemented on social media platforms. App scraping, which is a bit more difficult to do on mobile, but also possible. And then finally, these synthetic research panels, which are networks of dummy accounts, and you can configure them with different characteristics and see how those accounts behave. So those latter three, the web scraping, app scraping, and synthetic panels, those are really where we start to see the increasing risk of terms of service violations, of CFAA violations. And so, those researchers have decided that they're willing to take on that risk. And obviously we've seen the result of some of that. So in terms of roadblocks, what I would say, there's absolutely legal roadblocks. So CFAA, terms of service violations. We also talk in the paper about conceptual roadblocks. So we have a huge issue around what we call the denominator problem, which is that, it's easy to kind of identify problematic content, but it's much harder to understand what is the denominator, how many users are actually seeing this, what's the volume of overall activity. And we've seen, exchanges between platform employees and the public around what platforms see internally, given that they have a sense of the denominator, versus what researchers point out externally as the volume of problematic content. We also talk about the issue of unknown unknowns. So, and this is why I think the Facebook papers were so fascinating, because external researchers think we have a sense of what the problems are, but we don't really know what the platforms know. And sometimes the platforms themselves don't even know what they know because, their reaches and their audiences are so vast and complicated. So I'd say those are the conceptual roadblocks. And then finally, we just heard some kind of general social media data access issues. The type of institution you're at and the resources that institution has makes a huge difference for the kind of data access you can get. Mobile access, as I said, can be difficult. The quality of commercial and paid data can be higher than what researchers have access to. And so that aggravates those unequal access issues. And then finally, because some of these platforms change both what they share and their format over time, it can be difficult to design longitudinal studies because the fields and data can keep changing. And so that's another issue that we heard just in general from the researchers that we spoke to. So that was a very fast overview of a very complicated topic, but that's how we see the field currently.
Very fast, but a very impressive and thorough overview. So thank you, Elizabeth. And Matt, I see some similarities between what Elizabeth is talking about and the world of clinical trials, right? This is another area where data sharing, and probably even more than social media, could sort of create these huge opportunities for public good. But at the same time, there is still this sort of inherent tension with corporate trade secrecy. Would you mind taking us through some of the ways that pharmaceutical and medical companies sort of share data with the public and one another, and how they end up kind of striking that balance with corporate secrecy?
Sure, I'll try. And like others, I'll just echo the thanks for the invitation to be part of this. It's always fun to get a little bit outside your lane and learn from others' experiences. So the first thing to really say is that transparency and sharing of clinical trial data is still very much a work in progress. And really, while there are companies experimenting with so-called open science and putting more data out there, or trying to sort of learn from data that's out there to develop a drug of their own, for instance, that's still a kind of fringe approach. The dominant model has resisted the transparency that we have to varying degrees in different places. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And frankly, one of the basic insights that I've come to understand in this field, given the sort of size of the companies you're talking about in some cases, is that you really only get meaningful transparency if you require it by law and you put the resources into making it happen and making it pretty easily accessible, frankly. So it's kind of, there's not a lot of magic to it in some ways, but the way the system works at present is there are multiple points in the process of figuring out whether a given intervention works, whether it's safe and so on, that data has to be shared. And that's a result of legal reforms that have been sort of hard won over decades, really. This has been a long known problem, the lack of transparency in the ways in which the published literature may be a distortion of what the actual evidence looks like in its totality. So when a clinical trial starts, you have to register your trial. Humans are involved and share the design of that trial. When results come in, you're supposed to report them within a certain time frame. And thankfully, that system has been in place for some time now. Clinicaltrials.gov is the source of a huge amount of research and independent validation of trial designs, the results of studies. Are they the same as they were reported in peer-reviewed publications? Often they're not. So that's helpful. And the other big milestone at which you get a lot of data is when a product is approved, or there's a decision made to approve or not approve it. In some cases, in Canada, they actually put data out there even if they reject the drug. That's not true in the United States. And so at that point of regulatory approval or decision making, you can learn a lot about the reviews that were conducted by scientific reviewers within an agency like the Food and Drug Administration. And you can, in some cases, in Europe and in Canada, less so in the United States, you can actually get the underlying trial data itself. Not individual data, that's the fault line around privacy, but a lot of the summary level data, which is still quite interesting, becomes available. As I said, it sort of varies a fair bit. In Canada, we already have data around the different COVID vaccines, for instance, that's out there, and people are trying to make sense of independently of what the regulator did, the companies did, and the researchers involved. You might have seen the op-ed in the Washington Post in the last couple of days talking about how the same request made to the FDA, which doesn't proactively post the same level of data, is reportedly going to take 55 years, according to the agency, to put online. Somehow, little old Canada has managed that in a matter of months. So, you know, there are different approaches and parameters around it, but they are these discrete points in time. And what we've seen during the pandemic in particular is the need for more dynamic data sharing. And even if you get the data, it's great to independently validate someone's findings, but to actually use it in the context of developing your own drug, there's other barriers to that in the form of patent law and other kinds of IP. You mentioned trade secrecy. Some data still is not shared. Like what's your manufacturing process for a drug or a vaccine? That is still hived off from the results of a clinical trial. So there are still these boundaries that are being contested, and for good reason from my perspective in the context of COVID, given the shortfall in vaccine supply in other parts of the world. So we still have some work to do, and getting companies to comply with those data sharing requirements requires some resources as well. Work in progress, But compared to even 5 years ago, we have a lot more data out there, and hopefully the norms are shifting. And as other regulators put stuff out there, it sort of may embarrass the FDA into action. So there's this way in which, sort of all boats will be lifted if the tide of transparency actually comes to pass. I can say lots more about drugs, but I'll keep it there for now.
Thank you, Matthew. It's very interesting to hear about these sort of similarities and differences there with social media. And I really like that phrase that you used, the fault line around privacy. It's just a great way to put it. And I think it's a way that a lot of us in different industries sort of feel like we have to navigate those privacy problems. Sort of on that privacy note, on Tuesday at FOSO, we heard Rebecca Tromble talk about how platforms can use privacy as a shield when it is convenient, as a shield from transparency. Beatrice, I wanted to ask you about this in particular, in terms of sort of smart city and other urban technology companies, maybe like Airbnb and Uber. Would you maybe talk about sort of what some of those data sharing initiatives look like, and whether or not you've seen that kind of dynamic play out of companies using privacy as a transparency shield?
Right. Thank you, Gabriel. And before I start, I would also like to thank you and the rest of the organizing team for having us. It's been a great event, and it's just great to follow on Matthew and Elizabeth's remarks, which are very interesting and also from a completely different field than mine. So it's very interesting to just see the parallels and how some of these issues show up in different settings. So I've actually seen those arguments or privacy arguments being raised by platforms in what is rather a contested relationship between what we call urban tech and cities since the beginning. So it's already almost, oh, I'm low, sorry. So it's been almost always since platforms arrived that cities have been trying to struggle with the disruption of urban spaces, and what Uber means or Airbnb means for local housing, or the e-scooters. And if you talk to city government officials, it always feels like the newest tech is like a deja vu of whatever the former disruption was. And one of the interesting things is that many of these platforms, actually not all of them, have tended to have strong legal strategies to avoid local regulation. So we've seen, for example, heavy lobbying in the United States, where Uber managed to declassify itself as something very different from taxis. And so cities, for example, most cities in the United States lost the legal capacity to regulate Uber. Airbnb has had a similar strategy, but they didn't manage. And as part of this legal strategy of framing themselves differently to avoid regulation, one of the things I've seen and I've written about this is that they raise privacy arguments to avoid data sharing ordinances. So the way it goes is that a city would try to regulate a platform, and as part of their regulatory ordinance, for example, there would be like a data sharing provision in which the city wants, for example, to know which citizens are listing their properties on Airbnb, or what are the routes of Uber, or what is the length of the workday of an Uber driver, or where are the scooters being parked. And the way the argument goes has usually it goes usually both two ways. One is by arguing that that information is part of the company's business records, and therefore it is confidential and should not be shared with third parties. And the other one, which I find more interesting, is that the platforms take the role of some form of the privacy advocates of their users and say that that goes against the privacy interests of their users. And the way they frame it legally for the lawyers in the room is that it violates typically the Fourth Amendment in the United States and other privacy provisions like the Stored Communications Act or the CCPA, for example. What's interesting, I think, is that the platforms strategize when they raise these arguments. So, for example, once Airbnb was largely lost the battle to not be regulated by local governments, they typically dropped these lawsuits, and they decided, well, if I'm going to be regulated by local governments anyway, I might as well collaborate a little and give away some of that information. So I think there's some strategizing there that is worth paying attention to. And another thing that I think is important to say is that there are actually very legitimate privacy concerns there, which are hard to sometimes balance against the strategizing of the platforms. And I think that's especially so in context in which privacy regulation sort of stops protecting users once we consent to privacy terms. So one of the things that I've thought about before is that one of the things that we should start looking at is not only thinking about what data can or can't be shared, but what can be done with it once it's shared. An interesting example, for example, comes from San Diego during the Black Lives Matter protest. It turned out that some of the smart streetlight footage was used by police departments to surveil protesters. Nothing major happened beyond a big scandal, but then that's, for example, that use that should have been forbidden from the beginning, but wasn't. So I think tailoring those mechanisms or those ordinances or frameworks that shape how we govern data that is being shared is something that is very important. And the other thing, which I think is interesting, is that something that might be very different regarding the point of view of the regulator and access to data from the regulator, from the researcher, is that I'm actually not sure, and I would be interested in having a conversation about this, or whether the unknown unknowns applies, because we also want to limit the power of government. Like I am a firm believer in the many advantages of some regulator access to data for planning purposes. There's super interesting example in New York City where the Taxi and Limousine Commission used Uber data to create like the first gig economy worker minimum wage, for example, and that was possible thank you to having access to data that allowed the regulator to understand how the workday of a gig worker worked. But I think an example, a case there is that the regulator knew what they were looking for. That's what they wanted to do, and so they made a very specific request about what is the data they know. I'm not very sure that if we're thinking about the regulator, we should open up data entirely, because of that. I mean, power is always a little bit dangerous, and we want to limit it too. So some intentionality about what data is being requested, it might be something to look at. And yeah, I don't know. I think I'm going to leave it there because I'm looking forward to a Q&A. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. I feel like that that sort of deja vu that you were talking about, it's funny to also hear it happening sort of between industries here. You know, people act like these problems have kind of never come up before, but sort of clearly they have. And in many other industries, they have also. So I just want to remind the audience that this is a good chance to get in your Q&A, in that we will sort of shortly be trying to look at this. We'll surely be looking at those and trying to answer some of those questions. But I want to dig in a bit on this thing that's come up twice now, this way of trying to, and also in John Sand's comment about learning about these unknown unknowns, right? Like, that seems to be a benefit of giving researchers access to data, at least when people talk about it. And is that the kind of thing that just sort of naturally happens, right? Is it you give researchers access to data and a sort of if you build it, they will come situation kind of happens? In other words, you know, is all that needs to happen is researchers need to be given access to data and good things will follow? Or are there sort of guidelines that need to exist to actually kind of get some of those positive public good things that we expect to see from giving researchers access to data?
Really, that's a really good question. I would say, you know, one debate that we had in the research team for this paper that didn't make it into the paper, but really informed how we chewed over the issues. You know, academic researchers, as anybody who's been in an academic institution knows, you know, have their research agenda, and they have their oftentimes fairly narrow set of questions that they're trying to answer in a very kind of particular genre of knowledge generation. And so, you know, we wanted to widen the lens a bit in the paper to talk about activists and journalists, because oftentimes it's those like civil society and journalism actors that I think have more curiosity and latitude around the unknown unknowns than the academics. You know, I think it will be interesting to see if we do have this new regulatory body, what the assessment and vetting mechanism is, because it can be very difficult. It can be difficult to define a researcher. It can be very difficult to define a journalist. It can be very difficult to define an activist. So, you know, I think you get more of that interesting unknown unknowns when you widen beyond the academic frame, but I think you run into real definitional issues around like who is a legitimate user of this data and for what purpose. So I don't think it's as simple as like, if you build it, they will come. But curious what my fellow panelists think of that.
Can I piggyback on that?
Please.
I really couldn't agree more. Thinking of this portal I mentioned in Canada and other sources like it that preceded it, despite a huge literature showing the difference between data that's in the hands of regulators and data that's been published, the uptake amongst academic researchers is pretty low, shockingly low, despite being free and easy to obtain, at least in some cases. And I think that really speaks to the norms that I think you were hitting on around their own research agenda. Actually, re-examining someone else's work is not rewarding very much at all. Validation is not innovation in the way that it's understood in academic and industrial circles as well. So even though that's the work we need to understand from or to gain the benefits at a public health level from pharmaceutical innovation, we need people to replicate the science, but that norm is rehearsed but not practiced, in my view. So, and I couldn't agree more too that a lot of the sort of interesting questions and key pieces of work that have made the system a little bit more transparent over time have come from civil society and journalists pushing it. But then there's this issue of legitimacy. And actually in my space, that's the area that gets the regulators the least comfortable, right? They have trouble imagining that those folks could actually critically appraise this data and make all kinds of assumptions about capacity and what's driving their desire to do that. And I would flip that question around and ask the same questions about the actors that they're more comfortable with and why. So it is a huge normative and norm shift that a culture shift that we really need to encourage. And I think folks who see transparency and data access as a way of just sort of disclosure, and it's really problematic. It has to be about setting a platform for more participatory forms of governance that are diverse by definition.
And that's not necessarily a North Star of the Academy, I would say. But, not built for that. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was thinking that an interesting parallel is actually the one of open data portals and government transparency. And there's some evidence that open data portals are used by a variety of actors. But it's in some instances in which they were supposed to be drivers of local innovation or things like that, it's unclear that that's the result they've had, and so it goes back to the discussion on how do we maybe open it up to more actors, because the more variety of actors will lead to a more variety of questions maybe, and that's already a benefit in itself. But what are the incentives to do that kind of work of finding new questions and understanding better what's going on?
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
But I was just going to say, just to not completely rag on the academic profession, I do think that there's been all kinds of interesting like disciplinary and sort of field innovation, and there are for sure like new journals, new subfields, new methodologies that have grown up alongside social media. So I think those folks are absolutely eager for this. But the sociologist in me is like, all this stuff institutionalizes and sort of reverts to the mean over time anyway. So like even there, I'm not totally sure that, researchers in the academic frame are the only check we need for accountability.
Just going off of that, Elizabeth, one of the things, so you bring up the endless sort of definitional problem of what makes up a researcher, and do we want to give access to folks more than just researchers? And one of the kind of solutions, quote unquote, to this problem that we end up hearing about is IRBs, right? Academic review boards that can just make the necessary ethical evaluations, give something the thumbs up or thumbs down. They deal with the privacy trade-offs, et cetera. And this is also sort of starting to come up in laws, in like proposed legislation as well. what do you all think about IRB sort of as a tool for being this kind of like ethical check and balance around research access to data problems?
I'm curious Matt's take on that, because IRBs were sort of built for your field.
Sure. And we call them REBs in Canada, research ethics boards, which serve the same purpose, although they're underpinned by not by law but by policy. And so there's actually real concerns about their ability to enforce standards. But putting those issues aside, my anecdotal experience and understanding of the literature about REBs and how well they do their work is that they are significantly under-resourced. And there's a lot of upfront review, and there's a lot of contestation around where does ethics stop and methodology begin, and what's sort of okay for an IRB to be looking at. And I think actually the privacy issue sort of brings it very closely to the nexus between the two. But then beyond that, following up to see what people are doing with research data that they've accessed, all kinds of secondary uses of that data, which is sort of course, so much more possible when you're talking about the kinds of data that not me, but other folks engage with. My impression is that they are not great at sort of maintaining oversight throughout that longer research process. So I think they are part of the equation that has an important role to play. Do I think they're going to be the linchpin to solving those difficult questions? Probably not, especially given the diversity of institutions we're talking about, right? And so it's very challenging, especially increasing with the growth of private IRBs as well, which I'm seeing get things done a lot faster, but also have a sort of structural conflict of interest that needs to be taken very seriously.
Yeah, I would agree. I think they're a critical piece, but they're not the whole. And that follow-on use and like what's the like kind of life cycle of monitoring beyond the design stage. I think those are really critical questions. I do think the privacy issues and consent issues raised by social media data and social media access, in the US context, in the context of the Belmont report, I think really do beg for like a rethink in general. And certainly, as a qualitative researcher in my training, I ran up against IRB issues. Like there are all kinds of ways where it's sort of an ill-fitting suit for the moment. And I think deep structural change at that level would help. I don't think it'll solve everything, but could make some things easier.
Yeah, and it's both. I want to give Beatrice a chance to jump in, but just quickly, it's IRBs tend to say, okay, well, it's been anonymized or de-identified to a certain extent. All bets are kind of off. And we all know that that's a flawed assumption or a risky assumption. And on the other hand, there's been some instances where you really need the data sharing and data sets to be combined from multiple sources, and IRB approval isn't enough to get the data holders to actually share that data. They'll still cite privacy reasons. And so when there's real value in combining those data sets, I've found that institution-based IRBs they're not sufficient to actually get that data set sharing to occur across institutions. So again, they're a key part of this, but I'm not sure they're going to be a solution per se.
I actually think I have little to add, except just I do think they provide an interesting precedent of how some of this data sharing might be shaped in the future at all sort of institutional level, journalists, also policymakers. There are things there, but as Matthew and Elizabeth were saying, the different stages of review are important to look at and how to combine data. But yeah, it was very interesting to listen to you.
So looking at one of the questions that we have in the Q&A here, Chip is bringing up this point about sort of technical solutions to this problem, right? A lot of what also people talk about, they will say, they'll talk about differential privacy, they're talking about synthetic data, they're talking about adding noise to the data. Do you feel like these are the sort of more promising angles than kind of IRB or coming up with new institutions, right? Just like have a base layer of technical interventions that we assume, and that becomes our norm for when it's okay to make researcher access to data, or does that end up kind of glossing over too much?
I can try to go first. I think it's a mixture of both, and we should be at a stage in which we sort of try to imagine both um, a combination of code and law when we think about this type of data sharing. Like, I think there are some technical solutions that are very interesting. Some are very complicated, like differential privacy or some form of decentralized structure for data sharing, which is what's common in some contact tracing apps, for example. And some are very easy. I was just asking for aggregated data instead of very granular data, if the question you're asking allows you to answer it with less detailed data. So, but I think we can't over rely only on the technical solutions, but the institutional solutions will also be important, especially as, for example, we were saying some of the assumptions about differential privacy or aggregated data might not hold if we are aggregating a bunch of data sets. There are also trade-offs involved when we choose these technical solutions. And they're often portrayed as if they weren't. But one of the interesting discussions in contact tracing apps was, for example, that if the apps are very privacy secure, meaning that the data never really leaves the phone, then health authorities were not going to have access to the data about who was I guess sick is the word, I don't know, but who had tested positive, and that curtail some of the public health objectives. So there are trade-offs there as well, and I think we need to start thinking about technical standards and institutional mechanisms as something that needs to go in tandem, and obey, of course, about how we're framing the problem that we're addressing. Like, what is the public issue that we're trying to address, and depending on those, different institutional arrangements and different technical arrangements might lead us there.
I'll bite as well. So, I mean, I think they can be helpful. I worry about them for two very different reasons, though. On the one hand, I think with transparency, at least in pharmaceuticals, you make one thing, you open one thing up, something else closes down. It's like, instead of writing an email, you have a phone call. Well, the same way, there's this move to aggregate data and share that data because privacy. But and there's probably only, a few dozen people who are interested in doing this in the world, but like looking at the individual level patient data in a clinical trial is a huge task. But for those folks and, really big purists around evidence-based medicine and prescribing decisions, that is the work and they want to do it. And so you can't take away the option for those folks, and we all benefit from it at the end of the day most of the time, to give them the case report forms of the people. But that's not even shared with regulators anymore. And so it's happened in lockstep with making summary data available. Now they don't even ask case report forms unless someone dies. So we have to be mindful of whether it's sort of moving where the real action is, and if people are denied access to that, it's a worry, if that's what a technical solution might mean. The other reason I worry about it is I think it can help by putting into place technical fixes and getting more data out there. You start to shift the norms, but at bottom, these seem like ultimately structural political problems to me around who has control over knowledge and how it's produced and what questions are asked. And so a technical solution can assist with starting the kind of culture change work that I see as necessary, but you ultimately need to shift the sort of control over the knowledge production process. And to achieve that, I'm not sure technical solutions are enough. It's a larger political project. So helpful, but again, need to do more.
I agree with both of you. I think it's both technical and institutional, and I think it can be compelling to believe that technical solutions are institutional fixes when in fact they're just kind of reinforce the status quo. So I totally agree about trying to figure out where that power should be shared and who has the power to generate knowledge. Just narrowly on the differential privacy, I'll say that in the course of our research, it was surprising to me how kind of like undeveloped the methodology itself is. And there are plenty of researchers who said like this could be helpful, but sometimes there's mixed results, and it kind of depends on what the quality of the underlying data is, and it can be implemented poorly. So I think there's more work to be done on that particular tool to sharpen it. And so that has to be part of the agenda as well, as getting the tools to work better.
Great. So we have really only 2 or 3 minutes. So I want to have a sort of surprise lightning round question for you all, which is, in just a sentence or two, what do you see as the sort of structural or political reasons around why why these sort of data holders in your industry don't want to share data? Like, just very briefly, why are they so hesitant to share this data in the first place?
So I think it's a combination of mixed incentives, honestly. I think the privacy regulations and the patchwork of privacy regulations creates mixed incentives. I don't think transparency is aligned with the business model of social media platforms. And I think organizationally, they're not set up to execute on the transparency that some of us would like to see. So a lot of times the teams that are working on the kind of patchwork transparency are spread throughout the organization. There's nobody at the top who's responsible for it. So I think, in that sense, just mechanistically, it can be difficult for these organizations to produce the kind of transparency that we might want to see.
I'll say 2 things. One, pharmaceutical companies don't want to because I think they're fundamentally skeptical. Same one that the regulators have is ambivalence or doubt about someone who is a researcher and can they legitimately analyze what we've done. It's so complicated. So there's a skepticism. When it comes to other kinds of data that they keep even more confidential, such as the costs of developing a drug or the different prices in different jurisdictions, that's a very financial reason. So it depends on the data you're talking about in what industry. The motivators are slightly different.
Yeah, I think the urban platform world is also about financial incentives, and their business model has often benefited from not being very transparent about what they're doing or how they're behaving. I also think there are a bunch of institutional internal incentives. For example, I really respect the privacy team of Uber, even though I don't necessarily agree with the arguments they're raising, but I think the institutional setting and the legal framework does create the arguments for them to be worried about their user privacy. And I don't think the individuals behind Uber are necessarily acting in bad faith, or Uber or Airbnb or whatever, when they're raising this kind of argument. So I think there are both institutional and financial incentives that make it harder for them to want to share that data.
Great. Really excellent job answering them in lightning time, because that brings us to the close of this panel. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, Matthew, and Beatrice, for an excellent panel. Elizabeth, I know I put some of your work in the chat, but I'm about to put some of Matthew and Beatrice's as well, all very much worth checking out. And thank you for participating in this panel. I am now going to hand it back to you, Emma.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Gabe, and thank you so much to Beatrice, Matthew, and and excuse me, Elizabeth. We are going to take a quick break. I'm going to get a drink of water, and we will be right back in a couple of minutes with our final panel of the session. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. For our final panel of the Future of Speech Online 2021, we will be discussing the question, can transparency be mandated by law? A lot of the early discussion around transparency in the tech sector has been about voluntary company practice. As we heard a couple of days ago in our first panel, sort of laying out an overview of the transparency issues in the tech industry, early transparency reports from companies like Google launching their first report in 2010 about government demands for access to user data or content restrictions were really done on a voluntary basis, not through legal mandate. They were in response to a lot of public criticism, public pressure, and internal company decision making, but there was no kind of law compelling the production of these reports. Over the years, we've had a lot of advocacy coming from civil society and academics about wanting to see more information about terms of service enforcement and community guidelines enforcement, including through things like the Santa Clara principles for transparency and accountability and content moderation. And in general, a push for companies to make their policies clearer to their users, to experiment with how to explain to users what the rules are for a particular platform or forum or other place where they might be communicating. And as we just heard in the previous panel, there's been a lot of work on voluntary sharing of data with researchers and independent experts to analyze what's going on in companies or just understand things about the online communication environment better. We've also seen a number of instances of researchers engaging in self-help and just getting access to data that is technically available to them, even if it's not with the particular cooperation of any given company. So all of this sort of voluntary efforts at transparency aligned pretty well with the relatively hands-off or deregulatory approach to online services that many countries around the world have taken since the late 90s. But it's 2021, and around the world, most governments are reconsidering their legal frameworks around online intermediaries, whether that's their liability for potentially illegal content, trying to craft regulations about what to do with harmful or so-called lawful but awful content. And in these discussions, transparency ends up being a big part of the conversation. So we see right now in countries around the world proposals that would actually require companies to produce transparency reports or to make certain information about content removal decisions available to users, including notifying users of exactly why their content was removed from any given service. We've also seen, as the previous panel was just discussing, a lot of work looking at how to remove legal barriers to the ability for researchers to access data held by companies, or even to require that companies provide data to vetted researchers through different mechanisms. And we've also seen a real development of this question around third-party assessments or audits of company practice, either against the risks that those products and services might pose to human rights, or more nebulous ideas about kind of whether the companies' services might cause harm that is not illegal in a given country. So all of these different kinds of transparency are very much in the mix, but every country or region is kind of approaching it differently. They have different underlying legal frameworks, different attitudes and orientations towards the question. But because this is still a globally interconnected network, for the most part, the way that one country answers these questions is probably going to have ramifications for people worldwide. So to help us unpack this topic of what could be mandated in law about transparency, and to explore what those ramifications of different kinds of laws might be, we've got a really stellar set of panelists. First up, we'll have Eric Goldman, who's a professor of law at Santa Clara University School of Law, where he is also the Associate Dean for Research, the supervisor of the Privacy Law Certificate, and the co-director of the High Tech Law Institute. You may also know him from his fantastic and long-running technology and marketing law blog. I don't think I got the title quite right. I usually just call it Eric Goldman's blog. Next, we have Augustina Del Campo, who is the director at the Center for Studies on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information at the University of Palermo in Argentina. She is also the vice chair of the Global Network Initiative. Barbara Bukovska is the Senior Director for Law and Policy at Article 19, the Global Freedom of Expression Advocacy Organization. She has a distinguished career as a human rights litigator and has initiated around 50 cases before the European Court of Human Rights. And finally, we'll be joined by Mishi Chowdhury. who is the founder of the Software Freedom Law Center, the premier nonprofit organization representing the rights of internet users and free software developers in India. Mishi practices law both in India and in the United States. So to get us started, first, I'm going to come to Eric. So Eric, as you know, the US Congress is considering a variety of legislative proposals that would mandate some aspect of transparency. And several US states have enacted state law requirements around transparency. Based on your research, could transparency be mandated in the United States, consistent with the First Amendment?
Yeah, thank you, Emma. And thank you to CDT and to the Charles Koch Foundation for putting this event together and for convening such great conversation. It's a great honor to be a part of it. I have been researching what the First Amendment says about the ability to impose what I call editorial transparency, which can really take a variety of forms, as Emma was indicating. I divide it into 4 categories. The first category is disclosure about the editorial policies that the service is following. So these could be things like, tell us your rules, tell us your house rules, tell us your content moderation guidelines, and mandating that those be disclosed. Already many companies disclose them, but the regulators probably want more than what they're seeing. The second category is what Emma's referring to as explanations. Individual decisions being explained why they're being made. So you might have the broad policies, but then somebody might want an explanation of why this particular one is being explained. Third is the category of statistical reports, things like the classic transparency reports. Tell us the numbers about various categories of activities. And there's a fourth one, and one that I think gets overlooked, and I think really is the crux of the matter, what I call source data disclosure. So this is disclosure about what the service saw that allowed it to make the judgments that led to any of the other 3 disclosures. Or it could be just a compulsion that they have to disclose it even if there's not any other disclosure requirement. It's basically saying, if you're going to tell us these are your policies, give us the data that you're seeing so we can see if that's actually your policy. Or if these are the explanations, tell us what data you saw so that we can understand why you chose that explanation. Or tell us what data you saw so that we can double check your statistical calculations. And it's this latter piece that I think people are glossing over. Really, the question is, how will any of the disclosures be enforced by government regulators to make sure that they're accurate or validated? And putting the regulators in the shoes of the internet service to see what they're doing, to double check their work, and really to second guess their work, as well as to weaponize the pieces they think are most extreme, and to cherry pick out a story that they want to tell from the data, I think offends the First Amendment in a number of ways. And I think really gets down to this notion of the entanglements with the editorial process of the internet services. It puts the government regulators in the shoes of the editor and says, you're going to double check every single editorial decision and see if you would have agreed. And I don't think the First Amendment allows that. Now, for those of you outside of the United States, you might be saying, okay, that's the US wacky First Amendment. We don't have that here. But I encourage you to think very carefully about this source data disclosure problem, how these reports are going to be validated by regulators, and think about how that could be weaponized in your country and abused by the regulators who are going to be doing the enforcement work to do all the reasons why we might be unconstitutional here in the US.
Thank you, Eric. That was, I think it's a really great way to kind of focus in some of the questions that we have about what these mandates might look like. I want to bring in Augustina Del Campo to talk with us a little bit. So in Argentina and in Latin America more generally, how have transparency requirements already been incorporated into law? And along the lines of Eric's questions, like, do you think those kinds of requirements could be mandated for content moderation activity?
Hi, Emma. Hi, Eric. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. It's been such an interesting 3 days of this conference and a lot of information, very useful information. So thank you very much. Very honored to be here. So the question that Eric ended on was the one I kept thinking of after our prep call last week. And there's a number of things that we thought of with the Lilly team based on that question. So what kinds of informations and where do our sources for information mandates come from? And there are very different sources and foundations to demand transparency in our law. For one, there's the Inter-American system that in Article 1.1 has a duty to protect and to prevent and guarantee human rights and prevent the violation of human rights. And that has been interpreted as an obligation on the state to organize its entire legal structure in order to prevent abuse of those human rights and to guarantee the effectiveness and enjoyment of those rights. And then there's Article 13 of the American Convention on Human Rights that also mandates states or prohibits states from allowing private or indirect restrictions to freedom of expression. And it includes a couple of examples. The examples, of course, are dated by now, but they do include monopolies, for example, and the establishment of monopolies by law, or the inability to fight monopolies with law. Those could also be interpreted as violations of Article 13. So based on those duties to guarantee and to prevent, you can draw from there certain abilities from the authorities to ask and demand for transparency. On a constitutional level, and here in Argentina and comparatively I think in the entire region, but I ask everyone who has additional information to supply it. The application of constitutional law, at least in most Latin American countries, is more horizontal than vertical, like the US is. So human rights obligations or civil rights obligations under a constitutional law are mandatory not only vis-a-vis the state, but also between private citizens. So the obligations for non-discrimination, for example, are applicable to a number of different actors, not only the state. In that same logic, when the state finds or there are arguments alleging freedom of speech violations by a private actor, the state does have an ability to demand information to substantiate that claim. A third one is access to information laws. There's a number of access to information laws across the region, and some of them include access to information of private companies when those companies are performing a public interest function, which is interesting. It has been mostly applied to companies that have some participation of the state within their shareholders and whatnot. But the language in a lot of those access to information laws could very well justify access to information requirements to companies if the companies are deemed to be performing a public interest function. Finally, consumer protection laws, terms of service, and how those terms of service are applied, the processes within the companies to enforce those terms of service could very much fit within a lot of the consumer protection laws that we have in Latin America, that many of the different jurisdictions around the continent have. Having said this, and we can go a little bit deeper on this in the Q&A, I think there's a radical difference that needs to be acknowledged. You talk about editorial freedoms, and I think that's great from a First Amendment point of view. I don't think anyone in Latin America would speak of companies as having editorial freedoms. They could have commercial freedoms, and they could have other kinds of arguments, but we have not seen in any of the intermediary liability cases a company argue their editorial freedoms in Latin America. And I think the reason behind that is that intermediaries and as you probably know, Latin America doesn't have, none of our countries have a specific internet intermediary liability regime. We are still under the civil law traditional responsibility mechanism. And in the interpretation that the courts have done of that regime, the courts have always viewed search engines and social media and whatnot, not as editors, but as posters and organizers of third-party information. And that's why we have the intermediary liability jurisprudence that we have. Had they seen them as editors, we probably would have a lot of decisions finding companies liable for everything that's illegal and harmful on their websites. So I'll leave it there, and then I'll pick it up in the Q&A.
That's great. Thank you so much, Augustina. It's some really interesting distinctions between the kind of the US and the Latin American sort of general approach to these issues, especially the different, like the absence of a specific liability framework, but also that kind of the conclusion that the courts have come to across Latin America of trying not to hold the intermediaries necessarily as liable for everything, but doing it by sort of categorizing them differently than editors as a way to get around the editorial discretion or editorial liability kind of questions that in the US, for example, we just have Section 230 creating a statutory answer to that question. That's fascinating. I would love to dig into that more, but I also want to bring in Barbara. So Barbara, in Europe, transparency is obviously a major aspect of the Digital Services Act, which is the revision to the intermediary liability framework being negotiated right now. We heard yesterday from a member of the European Parliament, Patrick Breyer, about some of the transparency provisions in the DSA. And countries, including Germany, have already enacted various transparency obligations. So can you tell us, how is the legitimacy of transparency mandates being discussed in Europe, or is it being discussed in Europe?
Sorry guys, hello everyone. I was muted unintentionally. I didn't want to talk to myself, but great to see you all. And also I think that already the discussion shows how very important we have to have a different perspectives and consider different contexts and different legislative frameworks. But going back to your question, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I don't think that we have a lot of discussion about legitimacy of this transparency mandates, because I think in Europe, there is pretty much agreement that self-regulatory transparency frameworks are actually ineffective or incomplete, unmethodical, and unreliable. And I think that there is a general acceptance that this government-mandated transparency or accountability regulations will happen in the near future or already happened. And this is also giving in the context the government is actually quite untransparent in their own conduct over what they are doing with the platforms, such as transparency over the number of reports or referrals or removals requests they are filing themselves. But as you said, Emma, they are pushing for increased tech sector transparency and several legislative proposals. And you mentioned DSA, but it's not just DSA, it's also proposed EU regulation on online terrorist content. Or in the UK, we have online safety bill, previously called online harms. And in Germany, you mentioned an SDG. In France, there was also a proposal, but all of those mandate transparency reporting. And we have to also acknowledge that a lot of this legislation, which is being put forward or was adopted, is widely criticized on freedom of expression grounds. But even the harshest critics of this legislation actually supported transparency provisions in those legislations. And also we have seen that in Germany, where the SDG was heavily criticized, as I said, there was quite important transparency revelations. We saw in reporting about a lot of details about the operation procedures of those companies, from staffing and training or the number of employees and all kinds of stuff, or how many contractors they're employed, or what sort of support services they have for their staff, but also more detailed breakdown of the content removals which they have per each relevant section of the German criminal code, or detailed breakdown of the time they took for these content removals, and so on. So this has been recognized as positive. On the other hand, I need to echo what Eric said in his introduction, was that there are very great limitations of what these data provide in the transparency reports. And they don't have, and there is a lot of complaints that they don't provide sufficient granularity to be empirically useful. And there is also recognition that this transparency disclosures or initiative really lack auditing, and they also lack credibility and accuracy, because the subsequent judgment of on the nature of the efficacy of an organizational procedure is hard to verify. But again, like back to your question, I think that in Europe, the discussion moved from, I would say, this is my assessment, from abstract discussion on transparency, abstract concept, and it's more focused on tailored transparency initiative in specific areas. And I'm happy to just give some examples of what the specific areas are, because this is also among Article 19 proposals, what these new regulatory schemes governing of activities of platforms should include, and how these obligations should be clearly defined. So we kind of argue that the types of measures for transparency requirements should include the obligations on distribution of content. So they should provide essential information, and they should explain to the public how their algorithms are used, how they are used to present, rank, promote, and demote the content. And they should also provide some granularity there. They should also explain how target users with unsolicited promotional content, whether they're on their own initiative or on behalf of the third parties as paid services. The second area is the transparency over the terms of service and community standards, and not just publishing these community standards, but also in a way they are easy to understand, and to give case law of examples how they are applied. And this is also proposed in some of those country legislations, which I mentioned. Then the third area which those transparency requirements include would be human and technological resources which are used to ensure compliance. So this is the detailed information about issues such as trusted flagger schemes, or who is on the roster of their trusted flaggers, how they are selected, whether they have any privileges included to their status. Then also how their algorithms operate to detect illegal or allegedly harmful content under the community standards. And also about false negatives, false positives, indicators, and so on. Then another area which is included is decision making. So this is also a part of redress mechanism. So they should notify how their decisions are affecting parties, how they give reasons about their actions, and so on. And then there is this broad category of transparency reports of what the companies are obligated to publish, in what consistency, and what details, how they should distinguish between certain removal requests from the government, from third parties, from public bodies, and so on. And again, we can go in a greater detail of what this legislation and what is proposed in the DSA include in terms of transparency, transparency reports. And then important area, and this is also refers to what Eric said, and we can go into more discussion about this, algorithms transparency audits, and this goes to verification of this transparency reporting and how they should give access to data set to regulators, but as well as the independent researchers who are vetted in some way, whether these are journalists or academics or otherwise, where they can verify whether company systems and algorithms are operating in a way the company claims. And also, one subset of these transparency requirements can also be considered the publicly accessible archives of political advertisement, where the legislators are increasingly asking for ad archiving being passed. So, for example, in France or in the UK, these are discussed. So there are some kind of some examples of requirements which are put forward in those legislations or those EU proposals for transparency requirements. And Obviously, the issue is that whether this can be audited and all these questions which were raised by Eric, but happy to speak about them in a later discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. And now I also finally want to bring in Mishi to talk with us a little bit about the transparency obligations that feature in the I'm going to get the full name of this wrong probably, but the Information Technology Intermediary Guidelines and Digital Media Ethics Code rules that were enacted earlier this year in India. So could you tell us a little bit about how the intermediary rules address transparency requirements and how are they fitting into the broader debates around online content regulation in India?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for bringing this conversation together. We don't have to go through the basics, but because everybody's having a great time nerding out on all these details, that really happens. I am going to resist putting on my US lawyer hat and not comment on any of the great fun stuff which is happening in Florida, where I just came from, or Texas, and but just talk about India. Well, I thought you liked tongue twisters, but you did get the name right. But for brevity's sake, we just call them IT rules because we've seen so many iterations of them. That's how we have stuck to them since 2011. So we'll just stick to that. They are a kitchen sink of everything. And so it's not just online platforms, but this is also OTT platforms like Netflix or Amazon Prime. These are also online news agencies, which are now also, everything is clubbed together under these rules. There's no suspense here because there is a transparency requirement under these rules. Rule 41D requires that significant social media intermediaries, which is a defined term, that if you have above a certain number of users, you become significant enough. And all the large American platforms fall under that because India is such a country where numbers actually boggle everybody's mind, and even a small percentage of the population means you are significant enough. So that means they're required to publish monthly compliance reports. Now, in these reports, they're required to mention the details of the complaints received, action taken thereof, and the number of specific communication links or parts of communication that the social media platform has removed or disabled access by proactive monitoring. I am going to say a few things. I understand that this is more granular, and I would love to talk about specific aspects of it, but I think that all these issues are not independent of the political economy in which they operate. And if we forget that part of it, then we are forgetting how each of the countries is actually looking at these legislation and trying to come up with various mechanisms, ostensibly to protect the user, because everybody's out there to protect the user. But in this ultimate struggle, the loser is always the user. That is the people who we are. And that's an important similarity where the territorial struggle between the platforms and the governments are happening. Indian Parliament, after a lot of dithering, today presented the final report, the JP report on the data protection bill. You would think it's only about data protection, but it has a lot of stuff about content moderation also. And that's why I say that political economy of all of this becomes really, really important here. There's some distinctive features to be observed in India's case, but the similarities across countries are also very important. I think because social media platform companies are coming to the end of their extraordinary laissez-faire relationship with the world's democratic governments, that's why we are seeing a big push in this direction. And we've also seen that no matter how hard governments bear down, no matter how much platforms spend on lawyers, PR armies to wear the states down, in the end, faced with the final offer, companies always fold. And not since Google abandoned China in 2010, a decision it has always regretted, has any platform been willing to forego a national or a supranational market. In that, when we see that in the context, when the IT rules come, the idea is, oh, we don't know much about what you're doing, so why don't you start publishing monthly reports? We've seen some reports, Twitter, in its characteristic way, cannot decide whether it wants to comply with the law or it doesn't want to comply with the law, and what its actual strategy is. But maybe with an Indian CEO at the helm of affairs, we'll have some more compliance. But Twitter doesn't have a report here. We have some numbers from Twitter. Google, on the other hand, did release a report with the caveat to say, this is what you require us. Your transparency requirements are only numerical for here. And because you are asking us to do it every month, we can't do it because just the data processing and validation will not work. That's why there will be a 2-month lag for reporting. That also tells you how the compliance requirement for transparency are written. And I'm only concentrating about the statistical reports and not the ones which Eric earlier laid down in terms of 4 numbers, which is about telling the users, etc., which are already mandated. Then what we learned from those reports basically were that, as always, the movie industry is the most powerful people all around the world. We can all talk about our own free speech rights, but Disney gets its way. And what we learned was that 98% of the content removal that time was about copyright. Then it was trademark, and then it was counterfeit. And interesting bit is that Google also came up with their own voluntary report, which tells us how many times government of India asked them to remove some content. And these are police takedown requests. These are also information which is required. The police just says, okay, we're investigating something and we don't like some people here, and give us some information. These come in the form of something which is an equivalent to a subpoena, but actually are a little different there. And the requests, instead of just asking for information, also say, we want you to block these handles, or we want you to take down this content. Facebook also came up with the report, and that also tells us a little bit about what's going on. The voluntary disclosures told us that Indian government issued 40,300 orders for information takedown. And because Facebook and Facebook and Instagram released a combined compliant report, and WhatsApp also declared that there were only 345 complaints which were received through a grievance officer who's been appointed under these rules. And it took action on 63 of such complaints. But other data told us that at least 2 million accounts were banned in a span of 30 days. We have no information about why they were done, what was done here. But overall, the larger picture I'm going to say is there is already in India a mandate on these transparency rules under IT Act. The free speech and expression debate, just like the US, the platform companies have tried to co-opt many a times, trying to get into those intricacies of how they also have rights, but it's mostly justiciable against the state, and we are operating in that gray area somewhere, where the companies sometimes want to pretend to get the benefits of safe harbor under intermediary liability, and other times want to pretend to say, oh, we are editorial, we are like newspapers, so protect us, just like the briefs they're filed in Florida and Texas. So, but because in India, it's pretty clear that if you have safe harbor, you will have to take down content if required by the government. They are erring on the state on that side, and thus removing content. The third thing I say is that at least in India, and we're seeing this in many parts of the world, because bad ideas get copied very quickly. And India is a very popular place where people look how to actually emulate what India is doing in a big part of rest of the global South as well, where perhaps US and European kind of judicial systems don't exist in the same way. So and why I say that is because I think the governments are deliberately gerrymandering the laws, how they operate. They include certain things and they don't include other things. In the way the IT rules are written also, the government has cleverly said, just give us the numbers, and you don't ever have to say, when we are the ones asking you to take down any content, or we are the ones who are asking you to reveal any kind of information. So overall, if we were to talk about there's not much discussion about why transparency, what are we trying to accomplish here, and what harms are we trying to prevent by imposing all these disclosure obligations. I think the motivation is platforms are wreaking havoc with our societies. We need to hold them accountable. But at least cleverly in India, it is only hold them accountable so that we can pretend. But as long as you can leave the political parties as the leaders out of this, that's how we want to play the entire game. And companies are more than happy to actually play this game. And that's why I believe that no matter how big a market is, I don't need to quote numbers to people about India, how important that market is. They're kowtowing to any kind of requirement by the government and leaving the user completely out. So the discussions when they happen in my other life on First Amendment and user rights and everything, they seem so far away from the kind of behavior the companies exhibit in our part of the world that sometimes one has a very difficult time defending the company's intermediary liability aspects also. But the law or the rules currently are under challenge in various courts in India on different aspects of it, but I don't see the transparency requirement going away. How effective it would be and what we will do with that data, that's something which we can discuss later.
That was great. Thank you, Mishi. And it's such a great illustration of how kind of bound up in all of these other questions around intermediary regulation, these questions of transparency are. I know one thing that we've seen in CDT has filed briefs in the challenges to the Florida and the Texas laws here in the United States that have various obligations on intermediaries, including things like essentially must carry provisions or things saying that, online service providers must host the speech of politicians or of political candidates. Some things that under First Amendment law seem pretty clearly unconstitutional, but a lot of it comes back to this question of how are courts looking at intermediaries? Are they like newspapers? That's a lot of the framing we're seeing in the US. Are they like newspapers exercising editorial discretion over a letter to the editors section? Or are they like, mere conduits or something like the telephone system that must carry the speech of all comers? Or are they somewhere in between? And I'd love to, it was great to hear from all of you about the perspectives that you're taking, Eric, clearly with the editorial discretion frame under the First Amendment, Augustina talking about the other kinds of obligations, like a positive obligation of the state to support the free expression of individuals. I'm curious where you come down, though, on these questions of just how much editorial discretion are intermediaries exercising when they're doing things like content moderation, and how do you see any risk or threat of different kinds of transparency mandates to constraining that editorial discretion, or ultimately putting a thumb on the scale of how companies decide what content to take down, what user speech to leave up? Barbara, I see you're off mute. Would you like to come in on that?
I'm not sure I understand how you what exactly is the question, but
Oh, I can clarify. Yeah, so I'm really trying to look at, I think one of the risks that we've heard about transparency mandates is that the mandates themselves, the requirements to disclose information about how a company is doing content moderation, will affect the kinds of content moderation decisions that they make, including maybe making them more likely to take down certain speech so that, for example, they can post bigger numbers of amounts of hate speech that they've removed, or responsiveness to government demands for content removal. I'm curious does this seem like a threat? Does this seem like an issue? Or is it just not even something that you think is part of the consideration here?
Also, you mean that the companies given the transparency mandates will be more able to game the system?
Yeah, either that companies will be able to game the system, or that in interest of getting a good grade on their transparency report, of complying with the obligation under law, that it will affect what speech they allow on their services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that I haven't to be honest, I haven't come across this particular concerns, right? But I think there are concerns that there is, to a great extent, some sort of not displaced, but overestimation of whether the transparency and shedding light on some of these practices will lead to additional accountability measures, and whether there will whether the shedding light on the malpractice of some sort of practice alone will subsequently lead to this well-intended action to resolve the issue or the risk identified. And there are recognitions that there will be limitations of the transparency, or there might be even unintended consequences, such as you are describing, or there might be a misplaced risk of harm put on something rather than on other areas. Or even whether this link between the transparency initiative and then specific outcome can be attributed and measurable. But to be honest, I didn't come across this particular concern which you just described. The concerns which we are discussing are slightly different, but maybe I just didn't come across it.
Could I go, Emma? Is that all right?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I want to make 2 points about what's taking place here in the US that I think are responsive to Emma's concern about basically the transparency being used to shape editorial decisions by the internet services. Some of you may be familiar with the litigation that's taking place in California, where Twitter is suing the Texas Attorney General Paxton for an open investigation that Paxton launched after Twitter, quote, deplatformed Trump. And Paxton made it very clear that he wanted to punish Twitter for that deplatforming decision. So he opened up an investigation that said, basically, tell me everything about your content moderation policies. And he also made it, quote, continuing in nature. What that means is it's an ongoing obligation. It's not a one-time data dump. So as Twitter's continuing to make any new decisions, in theory, they're supposed to send a CC copy over to Paxton so that he can take a look at that as well. Now, Paxton's made his retaliatory intent very clear. He wants to punish Twitter for having deplatformed Trump. And so he's going to use all the information that's gathered through this information demand to try and find the most punishable material. And if he can't find anything to punish him, then he's going to use other means like shaming or publicity to try to change Twitter's behavior. And Twitter has said in its briefings that they're getting the message. They know that if they want to get rid of Paxton from breathing down their neck, they should just do what he wants. And so we actually can see how these ongoing investigations where they're demanding the access to the good stuff is really a form of control. And I think that's a preview of what we're going to see in a lot of these transparency reports. The government's going to feast on the data disclosures and then use them for the most illegitimate purposes the government can engage in. That's just the way they work. The other piece I'll mention is that we're seeing some litigation now here in the United States over explanations. So a service will provide an explanation of its decision, and then the user will say, no, that's not right. Now I'm going to sue you. Give me discovery so I can take a look at all the other decisions that you made, and I'm going to second guess all of them and say, if you're saying that's explanation, but you have these other examples, clearly that could not have been the right explanation. And they're framing in things like a defamation. If you're explaining it this way, you're actually defaming me by harming my reputation. Now, I'd like to think that those lawsuits are going to fail, but there's no doubt that the internet services know if we're going to get sued over explanations, A, we'd prefer not to provide them, and B, if we're required to provide them, we're going to provide them in the most generic way possible, or C, we're not going to make the decision at all because of the fact that then we know we won't get sued for having to provide an explanation. So we're absolutely seeing this shaping and bending of the editorial policies of the internet services through the mechanisms where transparency is the hook that can create liability.
And Augustina, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I did. I certainly understand where Eric is coming from, and I agree there is room for abuse. But I also think there's I mean, at this point, there's a legitimate concern over the power of companies to limit freedom of expression and public discourse, and not just for the Trumps of this world, for everyday people, for vulnerable groups that depend on these platforms to communicate, to get their message out there. I mean, they are exercising a great amount of power, and they do have a very impressive machinery to enforce their terms of service and to design their terms of service, and that's all fine. They are private companies and they can have their terms of services, and those terms of service should be compliant with the law. They cannot be outside the law, and there should be a means to ascertain whether those terms of service are within the scope of the law. Like I said, in Latin America, at least, you cannot have terms of service that are manifestly unconstitutional. That should not happen. That gives anyone a cause of action under constitutional law. And you would not be able to verify that if the terms of service were not publicly available. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily frame the power of companies as editorial decisions. Again, I know this is a very US way of framing it, and I understand it. But I think by framing it under editorial decisions, we might be putting within the same bowl a number of things that are that in my mind at least are and should remain very separate and very different. As far as I understand terms of service, at least under Latin American comparative constitutional law, it's more like commercial speech than First Amendment protected speech, if that makes sense. And I think under civil liability regimes, I would like it to stay that way.
Sorry, Mishi, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. I think this is an interesting example of the larger thing going on these days, in which platforms claim rights for themselves in ways which are extraordinarily powerful as tools against any government regulation, but which have nothing to do with speech rights of individuals at all. I am in agreement with Eric that when you see whether it's Greg Abbott of Texas or Ron DeSantis, notorious for many other important things than this only, which is the current pandemic. And when they said that these state laws are intended to stop the companies from silencing conservative viewpoints and ideas, one sees that these laws are reflecting that kind of intent. And this is especially true, as I said, of Florida, where at least the assumption is that there are companies who harbor liberal sympathies and then exclude Disney completely because it has all these great properties in Florida, and that's how the law is written. So that if that's the example, and because we're all lawyers and we love the things about specifics, and each regulation has to be dealt with in those specifics, I think then companies are correct that the laws discriminate against certain platforms based on their political views. But what's concerning is that these companies are now using it to go much further and just saying, oh my God, you're using transparency, you're asking us all of these things, and claiming very broad protections because they exercise some editorial judgment, however minimally. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have also the idea, oh, we are never exercising it, we need the intermediary liability and safe harbors, but also give us the protection you give newspapers. Because they may make sometimes certain decisions, they are different from newspapers in important ways, and they're similar in some ways, because platforms are carriers of somebody else's speech rather than their own. And they can't exercise the same kind of curatorial content over everything that they publish because they don't want to take responsibility for all of that. And so I would say that companies this argument will make it almost impossible for any legislature to enact any carefully drawn law also to govern this. So just to say, for everything that way can be argued in one side to say, oh, you're taking away my rights here. And in countries like ours, I think now there's enough data to say that no matter what claims they make, there is not enough resources which are actually being devoted to countries which are not the US or the European Union. That's just the truth of the matter is whether Rohingyas are dying or whether WhatsApp lynchings are happening in India, the companies are like, yeah, whatever, not our problem. Unlike here, when we concentrate so much on Trump, in India, now there's enough information in the public domain to see when it comes to the political party in power, the platforms just don't want to do anything. They don't want to take down content. So I began this to say that the Hollywood industry is so much more powerful because we have over the years understood that copyright, trademark, counterfeit, etc., we can define easily, but these other things about hate speech and misinformation, because these are not so easy to define. That's why we've played into the hands of saying about, they shouldn't be the adjudicators and decision makers about what should be allowed and what should not be allowed on that platform. In terms of transparency, in the US, I mean, just to maintain records of what you removed, nobody, at least I haven't seen many. I know that Digital Services Act has made certain proposals, but I think a lot of it is about numerical data. Automobile junkyards keep a record of the parts and automobiles in the United States, and we have searchless warrants which are possible also there. There we don't claim anything, oh my God, that we are robbing the junkyard's rights of free speech and expression. There could be certain things. I know every law has to be examined on its specifics, and that's why I am somewhat in agreement about the Florida and the Texas cases, but I don't think that applies generally to everywhere and to say, oh, transparency is going to be used in a certain way because companies don't come with clean hands here, and neither do the governments in many parts of the world, including the government of my birth country.
No, and it does seem like a lot of this conversation is somewhat about that tension of how to keep both governments and companies in check and how to keep them both accountable for how they're affecting user speech. And, you know, Eric giving some illustrations of ways that we've seen in the US, at least, governments using transparency efforts as a way to potentially circumvent limitations on their own activity by the First Amendment. I could keep going down this rabbit hole, but I do want to get to at least one of the questions from our audience Q&A. So we have a very practical question coming in from David Sullivan about what sort of information do you think could be mandated to be disclosed to regulators and just regulators instead of the public to meaningfully explain content policies, practices, and decisions? If you're familiar with how this works under the GDPR, do data protection laws like the GDPR about kind of disclosure to authorities and not necessarily the public offer a model that's worth considering? Would anyone like to have a crack at that one? Yeah, Augustina.
Hi. Yeah. So there's one first distinction that I asked the first panel on Tuesday, I think it was, or Wednesday. I think there are two concepts that we should bear in mind. One is access to the information that's on the platforms for research, for example, for research on the social issues that we're concerned about the platforms dealing with. What exactly is the phenomenon around fake news online, understanding that issue, understanding hate speech as a whole, that requires access to information within the platform. And the other is transparency of what the company and what transparency around the actions of the company and not of the information that's contained within the platform. And I think those two are a lot of times being mushed together in a number of conversations. On transparency about the companies, I think there's a number of models that could be followed. There's the data protection There's the financial institutions have been mandated transparency for the longest time ever. The pharmaceuticals have mandated transparency for a long time as well. I mean, there are different industries that have already certain mandates over transparency. Environmental transparency obligations are also there as a model that we could use. I think the key question here, there are two key questions. One is, I'm not sure we know what information we need as opposed to the financial sector, the environmental sector, and the banking sector, or the data protection sector. I'm not sure we have the questions as clear as those other industries do have them. And the other is one point that Eric mentioned at the beginning: how are we gonna supervise this thing? What kind of supervisory mechanisms do we need? We don't want the government second guessing the companies, as Eric said. But then again, what kind of oversight are we thinking of imposing on these to follow up on these obligations of transparency? I think those are the two questions. And on supervision, the data protection one, I don't think is a good example.
Oh, Barbara, did you want to come in really quick on that?
Yeah, just a very quick one. I mean, what can the regulator require from the companies? I think that very interesting experiment, which was done by France, they had a group of from regulatory agency embedded in Facebook for 3 months, and they were supposed to be part of the practices and then come with the regulation proposal for France. And after 3 months, they actually came and said that they had no idea what to ask them. I mean, they didn't say in these very words, but basically they said that even after embedded within Facebook for 3 months, they still didn't have a clarity what the regulator could be requiring as compared to what should be in the public report. So I don't think that we can say it in 2 minutes, which we have left. But I think that there is the UK online safety bill is problematic, but I think the transparency requirements, and there is like a detailed list recently come to joint committee, which issued its report earlier this week, actually came with quite an interesting list of the requirements which could be disclosed to the regulators compared to public transparency reports. So you can look into that. But overall, obviously, we need a strong data protection legislation, and GDPR is probably not perfect, but better than nothing at the moment. So combination of those would be useful.
Emma, do I have 1 minute to contribute here?
Please do. Yeah.
My head is in a completely different place than the questioner, because for me, the government is a major vector of attack. So thinking about disclosing information only to the government and not to the public actually misapprehends the nature of the threat. We know that governments view internet services as honeypots of information already. And things like the Twitter versus Paxton case show the example of how governments weaponize the ability to get access to achieve their censorial goals. So for me, actually, I would invert the question and say, what information can we make sure the government doesn't get, knowing that they're going to be the vector of attack that we need to be potentially most concerned about, and then at that point, what information shouldn't be? Why, if information is available to the government, why shouldn't it be available to the public at large so that we can help monitor the government's activities?
And Mishi, this has turned into our closing thoughts round, so I do want to make sure that you have time for a last word.
I wish this were longer, because there are elements of what I can agree with all three of them, and the elements where I can't, but I'm going to take what Eric said. Unfortunately, India's federal government is like the Texas or the Florida government right now. So I will say that really does make a difference. I'll give a recent example of obviously privileged information can't really disclose, but India's one of the state police is acting basically against the citizens about a certain thing. An organization based in the United States, completely incorporated here, everything has to do with the US. the Indian police sends an information demand and content takedown request to Twitter here. And Twitter just says, hey, you know what? Indian police is asking for this. We are just going to disclose this because we are obligated by law to do it. No, you're not obligated by law to do that. There's no extraterritorial jurisdiction about that. People in the US somehow have now lost their First Amendment rights to speak here because Indian police decided something. So I will say that that's just an example of what we are asking about. What is the information we don't want to give the government because they already get enough. Because in terms of giving them power about content takedown and also arm twisting or censorship by proxy, which they already practice, is happening. But I will also say is these problems are hard and they're not going, and old ways of thinking, which we are so used to in terms of publishers and newspapers, and are not going to give us the right solutions. The platforms are not like the paper, and they're not like the ones, neutral pipes, which we thought they were in the early aughts or when this entire thing was starting. So to expect that these solutions are going to be based on some template, which because we think in common law terms or for so long we've thought about it, it's going to emerge, it's not going to emerge. And also each country is going to be very different. I get really bothered by the dominant First Amendment thinking in all of these discussions. As much as I love the First Amendment, but I think that Jamil Jaffer is correct, the co-opting of the First Amendment, and also for us as civil society members for a long time to have played into, to say, carry their waters to say, oh, you're taking away our speech, so we'll defend your actions. That approach has to stop. I think the charade always ends up in the fat cats, government and the companies making some kind of a deal, and then we are called for pictures at the end of all of that. And that has to stop. These are very complicated. I'm not saying that they're very smart people working on it, so there will be solutions. But this simplistic way of thinking about it, or you banned Trump, so we're not going to do this, and we're going to come up with a law, or you didn't, and now we don't want any of the other information, is like Barbara gave the example. It's hard, but it's also until we look into the black hole and try to get something out, we can't even decide what we want. So in the beginning, to have some numbers kind of transparency, I still think is a good idea.
Well, thank you all so much. I also wish we had booked the session for at least 90 minutes. I think there's so much more we could dig into. For one, I am thinking very much also about government transparency in all of this, and whether that's in kind of what governments are already doing to demand content removal, either under law or sort of extra legally, but especially as we see transparency mandates come into play in different countries around the world, what transparency of the government side of that activity can we get as well? Because that seems to be like it will be a really necessary safeguard for these different systems that get put in place around the world. I also really wanted to get everyone's thoughts of like, what do we do if and when we have multiple different transparency mandates active at once? But maybe that's just going to be a problem for the companies to solve. I think they will probably need and want some suggestions on how to approach that too. So I want to thank Augustina, Mishi, Barbara, Eric. Thank you so much for this excellent discussion. And thank you to all of the speakers who have joined us for the Future of Speech Online over these past 3 days, to all of the attendees who have joined, including some of you who I think have been to all 6 panels. So you get the gold star of FOSO this year. A big thanks to our co-host and sponsor, the Charles Koch Institute, for helping support this. And thank you to all of my CDT colleagues for really making this event a interesting and fun tour through the many different things that transparency can mean. We thank you all so much. I'm sure we will be seeing you again at a Future of Speech Online next year, maybe even in person, who knows? But until then, I hope you all have a really wonderful end of the year. Happy holidays to everybody, and thank you all once again.